You know what nobody warns you about when you start making bows? They break. Not sometimes, a lot. I went through a stretch a few years back where I could not keep a bow alive past the first 20 pulls. I would spend days shaping a stave, get it tillered to where I thought it looked right, string it up, and on the 15th or 20th draw, bang, it would explode in my hands, splinters everywhere, and I could not figure out what I was doing wrong. Then I started reading about how the Norse made their longbows, the ones that have been pulled out of bogs and burial sites across Scandinavia, some of them over 1,000 years old and still intact, still holding their shape. And when I dug into what those bowyers actually understood about wood, I realized I had been fighting the material instead of listening to it. Today, I am going to walk you through exactly what the Norse did differently, from how they chose their wood to how they shaped it, dried it, and balanced the forces inside. It's so the bow could store tremendous energy without tearing itself apart. Plus, stick around to the end, because I will show you a tillering trick using nothing but a candle that completely changed how I read a bow's bend. Let us get into it. What we are really talking about today is one of the oldest and most refined examples of applied wood science in human history. Norse bowcraft sits right at the intersection of material intuition and practical physics. And what makes it so valuable for any woodworker, not just bowyers, is that the principles behind it apply every time you ask a piece of wood to bend, flex, or hold a load. So let me give you some background on where all of this comes from. When we say Norse bowyers, we are talking about the craftsmen of Scandinavia roughly from the 8th century through the 11th century, though the tradition stretches back much further than the Viking Age itself. We have physical evidence. Bows have been recovered from sites like Hedeby in what is now northern Germany, from Viking Age Dublin, and one of the most famous examples is the Ballandary bow found in Ireland, which dates to around the 10th century. These were not crude weapons. They were carefully shaped, expertly balanced longbows, some nearly 6 feet long, made from a single stave of wood. Now here is what shaped their approach. Scandinavia is cold, heavily forested, and the people who lived there depended on hunting and warfare for survival. They did not have the luxury of a bow that might work. It had to work every single time, in freezing temperatures, in wet conditions, after being stored for months. And they did not have fiberglass or carbon fiber or modern adhesives. They had wood, one piece of wood, so they had to understand that piece of wood more deeply than most of us ever bother to. Their entire philosophy came down to something I would describe as reading what the tree is telling you. Every decision they made, from which tree to cut, to which side of the stave became the back of the bow, was driven by what the wood itself demanded. And once I started to grasp that, everything about bow making clicked into place for me. The first method I want to walk you through is how the Norse selected and evaluated a stave before they ever touched a tool. This is where most of us, myself included, go wrong right from the start. We pick a board that looks straight enough, or we order a stave from a supplier and assume it is ready to go. The Norse did not work that way at all. They started with the living tree. The preferred species was yew, and for good reason, which I will get into in a moment. But they also used elm and ash, depending on what was available in their region. What mattered more than species was the individual tree itself. They looked for trunks that grew straight and slow, with tight, even growth rings. Ideally, you want somewhere between 15 to 25 growth rings per inch. That density tells you the wood grew slowly, which means the fibers are tightly packed, which means the wood is strong and resilient. They also looked for natural reflex. That is a slight curve in the stave that bends away from what will become the belly of the bow. A stave with natural reflex is already predisposed to store energy efficiently. They avoided any wood with knots in the working limbs, and they paid close attention to grain runout, which is where the grain lines dive into or out of the surface rather than running parallel to it. Even a small amount of runout in the wrong place can create a weak point that leads to a catastrophic failure. I learned that one the hard way. My early bows were breaking because I was ignoring grain runout entirely. I did not even know what to look for. Once I started evaluating staves the way the Norse did, my failure rate dropped dramatically. The second method is the one that changed my entire understanding of how a bow works, and honestly, how wood works in general. It is the Relationship between sapwood and heartwood, and why the Norse treated the boundary between them as sacred. In a yew stave, and this is true of most bow woods to varying degrees, the sapwood and the heartwood have fundamentally different mechanical properties. The sapwood, which is the lighter colored outer wood just beneath the bark, is elastic. It stretches well. It resists tension. The heartwood, the darker inner wood, closer to the center of the tree, is stiffer. It compresses well. It resists being crushed. Now think about what happens when you draw a bow. The back of the bow, the side facing away from you, is being stretched. It is under tension. The belly of the bow, the side facing you, is being compressed. It is being squeezed together. So if you orient your stave so that the sapwood is on the back and the heartwood is on the belly, you have a natural composite material. Two different woods doing two different jobs inside the same piece of timber. The sapwood handles the tension. The heartwood handles the compression. And the boundary between them acts like a natural glue line in a lamination, except it is stronger because the fibers are continuous across it. This is the physics that allows a single stave of yew to store enormous energy and release it cleanly without snapping. The Norse understood this 1,000 years before anyone wrote equations about tensile strength and compressive modulus. They understood it because they observed it. They saw which bows survived and which ones broke, and they paid attention to where the break happened and why. When I finally grasped this principle, I stopped seeing a bow stave as one material. I started seeing it as two materials working together. And that shift in thinking is what took me from breaking bows to building ones that last. Quick thing before we move on. Everything I am sharing today comes from years of studying how the old shipwrights built, and I have gathered the best of what I have found into a book called Secrets of the Shipyard. 16 chapters, 25 hand-drawn illustrations, 150 pages of real craftsmanship knowledge. Scan the QR code on screen, or hit the link in the description if you want to take these lessons off YouTube and into your shop. Now, back to what I learned. The third method is one that sounds almost primitive until you understand the science behind it. The Norse did not saw their bow staves from a log. They split them. They used wooden wedges and later iron wedges and froes to cleave a billet directly from the trunk. And this was not a shortcut or a limitation of their tools. It was a deliberate choice, and it is one of the smartest things they did. Here is why. When you saw through a log, the blade cuts across wood fibers wherever they happen to fall. If the grain has any twist, wave, or deviation, the saw does not care. It cuts straight through, severing those fibers. And every severed fiber is a potential failure point when the bow is under stress. But when you split a log, the crack follows the grain. It goes exactly where the fibers naturally run. So your resulting billet has continuous, unbroken fibers running the entire length of the stave. That is tremendously important in a bow, where every inch of the limb is under extreme stress with every single draw. I remember the first time I split a yew log instead of sawing it. The billet came apart along this beautiful flowing line that followed every subtle curve of the grain. It was not perfectly straight, and that was the whole point. That natural line was the strongest possible path through that piece of wood. I was holding a stave that was already stronger than anything I could have sawn, and I had not even picked up a draw knife yet. The fourth method is patience, and I mean that literally. The Norse dried their staves slowly, very slowly. We are talking months at a minimum, and in many cases, a year or more. They would often leave the bark on the stave during the initial drying period to slow down moisture loss from the sapwood. The staves were stored upright, usually under cover, but exposed to air circulation, and they were left alone. Here is what happens when you rush this process. Wood dries from the outside in. If the outer layers dry and shrink while the inner layers are still wet and swollen, you get internal stress. That stress creates tiny checks and cracks that you might not even see on the surface. But they are there, and when you draw that bow and put the wood under load, those hidden stress points become the starting point for a fracture. I ruined at least 3 good staves by getting impatient. I thought if the moisture meter read 12% on the surface, I was good to go. I was not. The core was still closer to 20%. The Norse did not have moisture meters, but they had something better. They had generations of experience telling them exactly how long to wait based on the species, the thickness of the stave, and the climate they were drying in. For most bow staves, you want to reach a moisture content somewhere between 8 and 12%, and you want to get there gradually and evenly throughout the entire cross-section. The fifth method is the one that separates someone who shapes a bow from someone who truly makes one. It is called tillering, and the Norse approach to it is a masterclass in restraint. Tillering is the process of removing wood from the belly of the bow, gradually and carefully, until both limbs bend in a smooth, even arc when the string is drawn. The goal is to distribute the bending stress equally along the entire working length of each limb. If one spot is stiffer than the areas around it, the wood next to it has to bend more to compensate. That creates a hinge point, and hinge points are where bows break. The Norse tillered using simple scraping tools and draw knives. They would rough out the basic taper, then put the stave on what we call a tillering tree or tillering stake, which is just an upright post with notches at different heights. You brace the handle of the bow at the top, hook a string to it, and pull the string down to different notches to simulate increasing draw weights. At each stage, you step back and study the curve. You're looking for flat spots where the limb is not bending enough, and you're looking for spots that are bending too much. Then, you remove a tiny amount of wood from the stiff spots and check again. The key word is tiny. The Norse did not hog off material and hope for the best. They removed thin shavings, checked the bend, removed more, checked again. This process could take hours, sometimes spread over multiple days, because they also let the wood rest between sessions. A stave that has been flexed repeatedly will take a slight set, and they wanted to see how the bow settled before removing more material. I will be honest, the first time I tried to tiller with this kind of patience, it nearly drove me crazy. I wanted to get to the fun part, drawing the bow and shooting it. But the one time I forced myself to slow down and follow this method properly, I produced the smoothest, most reliable bow I have ever made. It drew 52 pounds at 28 inches, and it is still shooting 2 years later without a single crack. That bow taught me more about woodworking than any class I have ever taken. Now, let me share some patterns I have noticed over the years, habits most of us fall into that the Norse approach handles completely differently. The first pattern is forcing symmetry. We want both limbs to look identical, same width, same thickness, same taper. But wood is not identical from one side of a stave to the other. The Norse tillered each limb individually based on how that specific section of wood wanted to bend. The result was a bow that looked slightly asymmetric, but performed perfectly. The second pattern is ignoring grain runout. Most of us evaluate a piece of wood by looking at the face. The Norse evaluated it by looking at the edges and ends, checking that the grain lines ran parallel to the surface for the entire length. 1 inch of runout across a limb can cut your bow's life in half. The third pattern is rushing the drying process. I already talked about this, but it deserves repeating here. We live in a culture of convenience and speed, and wood does not care about your schedule. Every bow that exploded in my hands can be traced back to either a stave that was not dry enough or a stave that was dried too fast. The fourth pattern is over-relying on power tools. A belt sander or a bandsaw can remove material from a bow stave in seconds. But that speed is exactly the problem. You lose the ability to feel what the wood is doing under your hands. The Norse worked with hand tools because that is what they had, but even today, hand tools give you more feedback and more control during the critical shaping stages. The good news is, once you recognize these patterns, you can start correcting them one stave at a time. Now, for that bonus tip I promised at the beginning, this is a tillering technique I picked up from an old bowyer who learned it from his grandfather, and he claimed it went back to the Scandinavian tradition. I have never seen it in any modern bow-making book. When you are tillering and you want to find stiff spots in the limb, take your bow to a dimly lit room. Set a single candle on a table at about the same height as the bow. Mount the stave on your tillering tree and draw it to a low brace. Now look at the shadow the limb casts on the wall behind it. In low, angled light, every subtle variation in the curve becomes dramatically visible. A stiff spot that you could barely detect by eye in your well-lit shop suddenly jumps out as an obvious flat section in the shadow. I started using this method about 3 years ago, and it transformed my tillering. I catch problems now that I would have missed, entirely under fluorescent lights. It takes 5 minutes to set up, and it gives you a level of precision that is hard to achieve any other way. Now, if this kind of traditional shipwright knowledge is something you want to keep learning from, I have written a guide called Secrets of the Shipyard. It covers 16 chapters of Viking and naval carpentry techniques that have been perfected over centuries, the kind of stuff you will not find in most modern woodworking books. Scan the QR code right now or check the first link below. All right, let us continue. If you take one thing from today, let it be this. The Norse did not have better wood than we do. They did not have secret tools or magical techniques. What they had was a willingness to slow down, observe, and let the material guide the work. And that is something any one of us can bring into the shop tomorrow. Thanks for spending this time with me. I will see you in the next one.